Week on Afterwards, our guest is Senate historian Donald Ritchie. He'll discuss his reporting from Washington, the history of the Washington Press Corps. John Dickerson, White House correspondent for Time magazine, is today's guest interviewer. Afterwards is Book TV's author interview program. Each week, an author on their new book, and each week, a different guest interviewer.
Donald Ritchie, welcome. You are the author of Reporting from Washington, the history of the Washington Press Corps. And I want to start with a question about when the Washington Press Corps began. People think reporters have been around for a long time, but you cite a specific moment. What was that?
Well, I cite modern press corps emerging in the midst of the bonus riots in 1932. Of course, the Washington Press Corps had been here since Washington was here. The first reporters arrived with the first members of Congress and the first members of the administration in 1800. But they were essentially all newspaper reporters. They were a very small band of reporters throughout most of the 19th century and well into the 20th century. And they spent most of their time at the Congress, sitting in the Senate and the House press galleries. There was not even a room in the White House for the press corps until Theodore Roosevelt became president and built the West Wing and set aside a room there. The White House was a place where people who liked to play cards worked in the White House press room. The people who really wanted to get involved in covering what was going on preferred the Senate, because that's where the people who made the news were. In fact, when Congress went out of session, the reporters would all go home. The White House just didn't generate enough news to sustain a full-time press corps for most of the year. All of that changed really in 1932 and 1933. First off, the Depression hit. There was huge bonus riots in the city that drew out reporters from the sort of sedate life they'd been living in corridors of various agencies, going to press conferences and collecting press releases. Suddenly they were out in the middle of Pennsylvania Avenue with rioters throwing bricks at them from one side and army soldiers charging at them from the other side. They all became war correspondents right in the Capitol. And I think it tended to really radicalize their politics very abruptly. Been a very conservative press corps in the 1920s. But by the 1930s, they were a press corps that was very ready for the type of changes that Franklin Roosevelt was going to bring. Roosevelt comes in and he switches all the attention from the Congress to the White House. Suddenly being a reporter in Washington is a 12-month-of-the-year job rather than just the few months that Congress is in session. Congress is important always, but the presidency becomes the center of attention.
Was Washington the place to be, or did reporters want to be somewhere else?
Washington reporters had always seen themselves as the cream of the profession. And many of them really wanted to be here, but some of them came very kicking and screaming. The real place to be in the 19th century and the early 20th century was New York City. That was the hub of finance and entertainment. That's where the networks were, where the major magazines were, where the major newspapers were. If you were a foreign correspondent covering the United States, you're almost invariably stationed in New York rather than in Washington. Just wasn't enough news coming out of Washington to justify it. So the foreign correspondents would come down here periodically, especially during Prohibition. They tended to like New York, which is a much more open, cosmopolitan town. In fact, the first Foreign Correspondents Association used to meet in a speakeasy when they held their meetings. Fortunately, here in Washington, the embassies didn't recognize Prohibition, so there were some places they could come when they came down here. But for the most part, they didn't. And I found lots of information about newspapers abroad trying desperately to get somebody to be their Washington correspondent. Even the New York Times in 1932 went through several of their top reporters before they were able to get somebody to come down to Washington to head the New York Times Washington Bureau, the most prestigious bureau in town, and yet nobody on the Times staff really wanted to do it. Arthur Kroc agreed to do it temporarily, just for a few months. He wound up spending the rest of his life here. But it's amusing to read that kind of correspondence at the time, that they saw Washington as sort of a quiet place. Walter Trohan, who reported for the Chicago Tribune, swore that you could read a newspaper in the middle of any of the big avenues in Washington and never get run down, that it was not Chicago, in other words. And a lot of reporters would prefer to cover Chicago as a much more vibrant place in the 1920s than Washington, D.C. was. All that changed in 1933 when Franklin Roosevelt came to town, changed the nature of the news, made Washington the center of national news, and then during World War II made Washington the center of international news, and it stayed that way because of the Cold War immediately after the war.
So Roosevelt is the first president to deal with this modern Washington Press Corps. What tricks, how did he treat this new beast that he created?
Franklin Roosevelt was very different than any of the presidents who preceded him. In the 19th century, presidents would talk to reporters, but everything was off the record. The first president who actually gave a for-attribution interview was Andrew Johnson during his impeachment trial, because he was desperate to get his side of the story out to the public. But most presidents were just a White House spokesman. Right on through Calvin Coolidge, when the president gave a press conference, it was a White House spokesman was speaking on this. Herbert Hoover actually made a big jump to say, well, okay, you can quote, say the president said this. But at his press conferences, he would only take written questions in advance, and he would then respond to the ones he wanted to respond to. Some of the reporters used to joke that he only responded to the ones that he wrote out himself in advance. So the White House was still not a really good source of news for the most part. You had some colorful presidents. Theodore Roosevelt, for instance, used to give press conferences while he was being shaved in the morning. And there was a lot of sort of interesting, colorful character that would come out of his accounts. But it's Franklin Roosevelt who really recognizes that he has got to win the press corps over if he wants to get his very ambitious program through. Most of the newspapers were owned by Republicans. Most of those newspapers had endorsed Herbert Hoover in the 1932 election. Roosevelt realized he was never going to win over the editorial pages, but he could get the reporters to write about what he was doing and to write about it, hopefully in a sympathetic manner, to get it out to the public. He held twice weekly press conferences in the Oval Office. Reporters would line up outside, and then they would crowd in. They would try to get as close to his desk as possible. They would ask questions very freely. He would banter with them. He would sometimes argue with them. He would sometimes put them down and put down their publishers in the process. But then he would break the ice with a joke. And he would invite them to the hot dog parties at the White House lawn or at Hyde Park. He traveled by train, and so, of course, there was a lot of time for reporters on the train to socialize with him. He played poker with the reporters. He was extremely accessible. Now, he was also kind of slippery. He floated a lot of trial balloons, and a lot of times reporters thought they were quoting a straight story from him, only to have him deny it later on. And so there were some hurt feelings at various times, and he carried on some feuds with various members of the press corps. But for the most part, the Washington Press Corps really was in sync with what Roosevelt was trying to do, and they gave him the kind of publicity that he really was looking for, and it helped to build up his public support, so that in 1936, even more newspapers opposed him than did in 1932, but he won by an even larger margin. So somehow his word was getting out, both via the reporters and also via the radio, which he was a master of.
You write about in the book how he used radio, which is this new medium. There were new radio journalists in Washington, but he used radio to kind of go around the filter. We hear President Bush today talking a lot about going around the filter, and you also write about Eisenhower doing the same kind of thing. Talk about that a little bit, about using the, kind of trying to go through the press, or around them, I should say.
I think every president's dream has been to speak directly to the public without having reporters interpret what they're saying. Reporters don't necessarily even interpret it to say yes or no, but they pick and choose what to report on. Presidents want to be able to do their own reporting, in a sense. And so anytime a new medium has come along, the presidents have tried to figure some way to speak through that medium to get to the public. And radio came along in the 1920s, but Calvin Coolidge and Herbert Hoover were not great radio spokespersons. They were, Coolidge had a very nasally twang, New England twang. Hoover spoke in a terribly monotonous voice. He was a wonderful person in small groups, but he just froze before a large audience. And while he did very well in the 1928 campaign, because his somewhat bland Western accent was a little more acceptable on the radio than Al Smith's New York Bowery-sounding accent. But 1932, he was up against Franklin Roosevelt, and Roosevelt was able to take the radio and make it his. He had this grand patrician voice. It was almost sort of a John Barrymore of politics. People liked to listen to it, and he also figured out that radio wasn't just addressing millions of people. radio was actually addressing a small group of people, maybe just one or two people sitting in their living room. And he developed this very personal style that one of the CBS producers called a fireside chat, which sort of stuck for all of his speeches. He gave many of them during his presidency, to sort of sit down with the public and tell them what was going on about the bank crisis, about other politics. During World War II, he would say, I'm opening a map. If you have a map at home, open your map and I'll show you where we're going with this, where the fronts are in this battlefield. People really felt connected to Roosevelt in a remarkable way. So that's something that presidents have always tried to figure out how to work to their advantage. Yes, Dwight Eisenhower brought television into his press conferences. Eisenhower, however, his syntax was so convoluted that David Brinkley said that after Eisenhower's first press conference, they tried to put together just a little segment of something coherent, and he said there wasn't any. They had to actually patch sentences together to get Eisenhower to fill out a complete sentence. So Eisenhower, while he was the first to let the TV in, was not the master of the media. His successor, John Kennedy, was really a matinee star, and he made television his press conferences are still remarkable to watch. He used his humor and his charm to win over not only the reporters in the room, but the public who were watching as well. Changed the way reporters covered this, because it used to be that right up until the moment when the president finished, the reporters would be taking notes, and then they would rush for the door and run down to the telephones to call in their stories, especially the wire reporters. First time Kennedy finished his, everybody went running out the door, and then suddenly dawned on them that the public had been watching, including their editors back home. So there wasn't the same urgency to report in that news. But the reporters still had to distill the news. And I think that's the point that presidents often make the mistake, that because they can use radio or use television or use the internet, that they don't need the press corps. In fact of the matter is, it's the press corps that condenses the story, writes it up in a coherent way, and puts it out, that most people actually get their news via reporters either on radio, television, newspapers, magazines, or whatever, who have tried to take this massive information and make it accessible. And presidents, for the most part, realize they have to work through the press corps if they want to get their message across.
There are these punctuating moments with each change in technology. You talked about the Kennedy press conferences. There was one with each new, with radio and with television. Talk a little bit about when radio came in, how that changed the way reporters did their jobs, and then with television as well.
It's funny that you'd think that radio would have made its impact right away. In fact, there was radio reporting on presidential elections in 1920. There were live radio broadcasts from the Capitol in the 1920s when Coolidge was president, State of the Union messages, inaugural addresses. There was lots of radio around, and yet radio was not a major player in the news for that period. For one, because the newspapers didn't want the competition, and they did everything possible to pull the rug out from under radio, including not letting them have wire service materials, and because radio didn't have a large news gathering capability. As Lowell Thomas said, they didn't actually write the news, they stole the news. They swiped it from all the other newspapers and other sources they could find it from at that period. And you could not, as a radio reporter, get into the press galleries in the Capitol. You had to work for a daily newspaper to get a press pass. So the only radio reporters who were in the press gallery were those who also reported for a newspaper at the same time.
Which meant they can't watch the action.
No, and you could sit in the public gallery, but you can't take notes in the public gallery. And in those days, radio reporters had enormous equipment that they had to lug around. So it made the job very difficult. It's not till 1939 that the radio gallery is created, and it's created because the radio reporters go to Congress and say, those newspaper reporters won't let us in. And so Congress, which wants to be covered, opened up the radio gallery at that time. And that was just about the point in which the war was coming to Europe. I think the defining moment for radio was the Munich crisis. There was such major events happening that Americans wanted to know about as they happened. And so for the first time, you were getting live broadcasts from Europe. Edward R. Murrow is appearing on the radio for the first time. H.V. Kaltenborn is here in Washington and in New York. One of Kaltenborn's producers said you could wake up Kaltenborn at 4 o'clock in the morning and say one word, Czechoslovakia, and he could speak for 30 minutes on the subject. And that's what people wanted. They wanted to find out what was going on. They wanted someone to explain it to them. And so during World War II, radio really came about. Also, that the sound technology was changing. We've all heard the Hindenburg explosion, but that wasn't a live radio broadcast. It was an experimental taping that was going on just by chance when the announcer Herbert Morrison looked up and saw the Hindenburg burst into flame. And actually, radio listeners didn't hear that on the day that the Hindenburg exploded. They heard just reports read to them by announcers. It was the next day that the radio stations got that tape. And now radio reporters could go out and begin to tape. And of course, after World War II, the cassette tapes come along, or at least the modern tapes, as opposed to the wire recordings before that. Radio becomes much more accessible. And then, of course, television emerges at the same time. But World War II, I think, was definitely the defining moment for radio, 20 years after the medium was actually available.
When you describe how difficult it was for radio journalists to break into the network, it was controlled by print journalists, it reminds me of what we're seeing today with new technology, with bloggers, and with people report to web-based news services. Do you see any parallels there, and can you make any predictions based on what you've seen happen to radio and television, which had a hard time breaking in? Nobody took them seriously, and then ultimately became a part of our traditional news. Do you see any parallels there?
Oh, definitely. And the real peculiarity of Washington news, as opposed to other capitals around the world, is that in most other capitals, it's the government who decides who's an official reporter and hands them a press pass. In Washington, it's the reporters who decide who's a reporter. And this goes back to 1880. Before 1880, the politicians let people into the press gallery. The vice president let people into the Senate press gallery. The Speaker of the House let them into the House gallery. And a lot of lobbyists were realizing that the press gallery was a great place to gather information. So you had lobbyists who were masquerading as journalists, and journalists who were moonlighting as lobbyists. And when these big scandals began to break in the Gilded Age, like the Credit Mobilier scandal, not only were the politicians involved, but some leading reporters were involved. And this was an embarrassment to the press corps. So the leading reporters around 1880 went to the leaders of the Senate and the House, and they said, "You're doing a lousy job of deciding who's a reporter. Why don't we take it over, and we will elect a standing committee of correspondents to judge the credentials of reporters, and we'll post what are the rules for getting into the press gallery." And so they do. They start at that point. They say you can't be a lobbyist. You have to get most of your money from your actual journalism. You can't work for any executive agency of the government, be moonlighting as a journalist at night. And you have to file daily reports by telegraph to a daily newspaper. And that was what they felt was the definition of a journalist. In a sense, what they were doing was defining themselves. And overnight, it got rid of all of the lobbyists in the galleries. It also eliminated all of the women correspondents in the galleries. There were 20 women before 1880. There were none after 1880. Because the women, while they were legitimate writers, weren't writing hard political news. They were writing the sort of social news, very popular, but not enough to justify the telegraph tolls. So they would mail their stories back to their newspapers. Well, unless they sent it by telegraph, they couldn't meet the rules. Same thing happened with African Americans. Frederick Douglass had sat in the press gallery in the 1870s. The next black reporter doesn't sit in the press gallery till the 1940s. Why? Because the big white newspapers didn't hire black reporters, and the black newspapers were all weekly papers. And so they didn't meet the definition of a daily newspaper.
There were African Americans who tried to get in credentialed, and the members issuing the passes weren't very enlightened, were they?
They tried desperately, especially during the 1930s, when, of course, the African American community really wanted to know what was happening in Washington. But one black reporter said at the time that it would have been easier to get an interview with God than to get an interview with a cabinet secretary because you couldn't get a press pass. That means not only couldn't you get into the press conferences, you couldn't even get on the mailing list to get the press releases. So it was very frustrating for black reporters who tried all during the 1930s and early 1940s. Franklin Roosevelt actually stretched the rules of the press gallery or press corps in the White House to let in the first black reporter. There was one black daily newspaper, the Atlanta Daily World, that got started about that time. And even though this wasn't a reporter exclusively for them, some of his material wound up in that paper. And so the Roosevelt, who was looking for black votes and wanted to speak to the black community, said, "This is a reporter that we want in our press conferences."
And he also, there was a sort of a backstory to the Roosevelt letting the African-American reporter in as well, right? Wasn't he trying to do a little damage control?
Yes, so there was a very embarrassing incident in the 1940 election when the presidential party was in New York City, and the some of the reporters and some of the White House staff got separated from the presidential party, and the police blocked their entry. And in a melee that broke out between them, the president's press secretary, Steve Early, kneed a black policeman in the groin. And of course, immediately the opposition jumped on this and said, this shows what the New Deal is all about. And so they had to do a lot of damage control, one of which was to try to open the press conferences to a black reporter. There'd never been a black reporter in any of Franklin Roosevelt's press conferences up to that point. And Early kept saying, it's not me, it's the reporters. They're the ones who aren't letting in these black journalists. So Early actually takes the lead after this and really moves to get a black reporter in. The incident dissipated when the policeman said that he planned to vote for Franklin Roosevelt anyhow. And so that seemed to, it wasn't as big an issue in terms of the election, but Early realized that it was a problem that he had to solve. And actually, it was the politicians on Capitol Hill who did the same thing, ordering the Standing Committee to allow the first black reporter into the press gallery in 1947. Again, stretching the rules, because the rules were so tightly defined that somebody who was clearly a legitimate journalist but couldn't meet the criteria the way they were set up, eventually the politicians felt that this was unjust and that something had to be done about it.
And women had a tough time too.
Yes, women were kept out for a long time. You do see some women coming in the 19th century, often using their initials rather than their names, so that their newspapers don't know what their gender is. But there's a lot of prejudice against women reporters. It's not till World War II, when so many men go overseas as either war correspondents or as combatants, that jobs open up. And so it's in 1942 that Helen Thomas comes to Washington and gets a job. Sarah McClendon comes about that point. When the war is over, the men come back, and unless the women had such an awful job with the terrible hours and really low pay that no man wanted to take it, for the most part, most of those women lost those jobs right after the war. And a few were able to hang on in the late 40s and early 50s. But clearly, the rules didn't benefit women in any way.
Well, and even through the 60s, the National Press Club, women weren't allowed, were they?
Yes, that's another strange part of it. You know, there's a sort of myth of the liberal media, and yet the liberal media was not very receptive either to minority reporters or to women. And in fact, there were the National Press Club, which was the great watering hole for the press corps, did not admit women until the 1970s, and women campaigned vigorously. One reason why they wanted to join the club was because, not for the social side of it necessarily, but because they had these newsmaker luncheons in which visiting heads of state and other people in the news would come and speak to the press corps at lunch, and that generated a lot of news. Well, for a long time, the women weren't allowed in at all, and they finally had a compromise, and they said, okay, there's a balcony that runs around the place where we're having our lunch. The women can go sit up in the balcony. They can't eat while they're up there. They can't ask any questions while they're up there, and they have to leave as soon as the conference is over, but that will allow them in. And so this was sort of a mean solution to the problem. It didn't last, and there was a lot of complaint until finally, for really economic reasons, the press club realized that to save itself, it really needed to expand its membership and needed to put this issue to rest. And so it's in 1971 that it admits the first woman member. And then, of course, it's not till 1975 that the Gridiron Club, this very elite organization, allows women in. And the women were literally out on the street picketing the Gridiron Club, much to the embarrassment of the politicians who were crossing the picket lines to go in to speak. And so they did a lot of things to try to embarrass both the reporters and the politicians until they finally would open the doors.
And when the press club opened to women, you told a story about the first drink served to a woman at the bar.
Yes.
What did the bartender say?
Right. I interviewed Roy McGee, who was a United Press reporter, and he was gung-ho for admitting women. And he grabbed a woman reporter and he said, come on, we're going into the bar to have a drink. And they stood at the bar and they ordered 2 beers, and the bartender handed this woman reporter her drink, and he said, I hope you choke on it.
I want to go back to this idea of what we're seeing now, which is another perhaps barrier breaking with the bloggers and the internet.
Mm-hmm.
Do you, what's your guess, based on the history you've studied, of all of these technological and other barriers falling, what might happen?
It's so interesting because it's exactly the same story that happened with radio reporters. It's exactly the same story that happened with magazine reporters who also didn't write for daily newspapers. Television didn't have as much problem because the same networks that owned radio owned television. So the radio gallery became the television gallery instantaneously. But right now we have, for the last decade, we've had a whole new electronic media that's been developing. It's got the same resistance against it that broadcast had when it emerged. The journalists who don't do it think it's not legitimate. It doesn't meet the criteria that they established. It has to prove itself as far as they're concerned. And so when reporters for internet services, whether or not they're large groups like Bloomberg or small groups, one-person bloggers, apply, they don't meet those criteria. They don't make much of all of their money, for instance, from doing this reporting. Actually, very few websites make very much money, and most of them are losers for their organizations, but there is a real sense that they need to be in that particular market. So economics is really not a defining moment the way it is with much of the rest of the media. They're concerned that if they issue a press pass to anybody who's a blogger, that anyone with a modem can come down here and get a press pass. And every 14-year-old kid who's got a website could legitimately call themselves a web reporter. This became an issue during the Clinton impeachment trial in 1999, when usually the press gallery sits almost empty because people are watching the proceedings on C-SPAN. Everybody wanted to be in the Senate chamber to watch that trial. I've never seen the press gallery absolutely full before, but it was during that entire trial. A lot of the reporters who showed up were web reporters who literally didn't know their way around the Capitol. I actually took various reporters through the building just to give them a little orientation at the beginning of that trial. They were quite fascinated by it, and they probably would never come back again after that trial was over, but they needed to be there then. The reporters who were the regulars in the press gallery would get up from their assigned seats and find somebody else sitting at their seat, using their phone, trying to use their computer, and they would have to argue with the perpetrator that this was not their space along the way. So the Standing Committee does a very diligent job of trying to figure out who belongs and who doesn't, trying to separate out the dilettantes from the really professional journalists. But the definitions, of course, are set by the people who are already there. And what I suspect will happen at some point is either the current galleries will figure a way to extend their definitions to admit bloggers, certain bloggers and certain internet people, or the internet people will go to the Congress and say they won't let us in, and they'll create a separate internet gallery. The one place that has been much changed by all this is the periodical press gallery, which used to be essentially half a dozen magazines: Time, Newsweek, U.S. News and World Reports, and a few others. Now there are hundreds of newsletters that appear almost exclusively online rather than in print, that come out, that go to every interest group imaginable. North Texas oil producers, or whatever the issue happens to be, or an environmental issue organization that puts out a newsletter. And their reporters are accredited to the periodical press gallery. So it's quite possible that some of the bloggers will wind up in there. But not too long ago, the newspaper press gallery did admit World Net Daily, which really had to stretch its definition, and actually rejected it the first time they applied, and finally admitted them. And that probably set some precedent for allowing other organizations in. Interestingly, the person who was chairing the Standing Committee at the time of the controversy over the World Net Daily was a reporter for the Bloomberg News Service. And 10 years earlier, it had been rejected for its initial application. So there's a certain process in which persistence is definitely required to establish that you really are a legitimate journalist.
Persistence, a good trait for any journalist. We'll be right back in a moment.
Afterwards, with Donald Ritchie and John Dickerson, continues in a moment. Next Sunday on Afterwards, former CBS foreign correspondent Tom Fenton on his latest Bad News, the decline of reporting, the business of news, and the danger to us all. In the book, Mr. Fenton argues that the news media must disengage from the entertainment industry to regain the trust of the public. He'll be interviewed by the former co-host of CBS Nightly News and moderator of NBC Meet the Press, Roger Mudd. Afterwards, every Sunday at 6 and 9 p.m. Eastern, on Book TV, on C-SPAN 2. Afterwards, with Doug Weed and Harold Gullen, continues.
In your book, you write a lot about the forces between different news organizations. What role does competition play in moving the Washington Press Corps?
One thing I learned in writing this book is that the adversarial nature of the Washington Press Corps is not as much between the reporters and the politicians they're covering as between the different types of news media that's actually covering the same events. I was quite surprised as I was going along about the tensions between print and broadcast. And then within the broadcast media, between the networks, realizing, as CBS realizes that it's not competing against the New York Times, it's competing against NBC. The tension between the Associated Press and the United Press, or the United Press International, during much of its history. That's where you get these wonderful stories of people who are, in fact, as people recount their stories, they love telling how they beat somebody else out on a story, how they outsmarted them, even if just for a few seconds. With the wire services, a few seconds were essential because the first story to come across the wires was the story that would often get printed first or would get announced on the radio. It would take the lead. And so they were rewarded, in a sense, by beating out the opposition. Probably the most famous moment in wire service history in terms of somebody beating somebody was the president's assassination in 1963, when there was the wire services reporters for the AP and the UP were riding in a car just behind Kennedy's car. As they got into Dealey Plaza, they heard the loud noises. The Associated Press reporter thought it was firecrackers. The UP reporter, who was an avid gunsman, realized right away it was gunshots. And there was a mobile phone, and he picked it up. That was Merriman Smith of the United Press. And he called in the first dispatch that 3 shots had been fired at the president's motorcade. And then he held on to the phone. He doubled up over the phone. Jack Bell, who was the Associated Press reporter in the backseat, was desperately trying to get the phone away from him, to the point that he was beating on Merriman Smith's back. And by the time Smith finally gave up the phone had gone dead. And so the Associated Press reporter was not able to call in his story until the car got to the hospital. And Merriman Smith beat him constantly during that day, and the next day's newspapers really reflected the United Press accounts. Merriman Smith won the Pulitzer Prize for his reporting on that. But when he got back to his office that night, he lifted up his shirt, and his back was just covered with red welts from where the Associated Press reporter had beat him on the back. And that, it seemed to me, epitomized the tensions that were going on.
These other, the columnists, too, you write about Lippmann versus Joe Alsop, these huge forces in both domestic U.S. foreign policy, domestic policy, but also all over the world. Talk a little bit about the competition between those two.
That's right. In the 19th century, the editorial sort of spilled over into the news pages. You could tell if you picked up a newspaper, it was a Republican paper or a Democratic paper, just from the front page stories that were going on. By the late 19th century, because commercial advertising had taken over from political patronage, newspapers tried to build a firewall between their editors and their reporters, in a sense. Their opinion could be on the editorial page, but reporters were just supposed to report the news objectively. And so certain reporters were elevated to the status of columnist, and they were given a license to express opinion. And in Washington, that begins really in the 1930s in a big way. One of the first really successful Washington correspondents is Drew Pearson, who has a column called the Washington Merry-Go-Round. Starts in the 1930s, continues to the 1960s, and was picked up by Jack Anderson and continued on. Pearson's column was in far more newspapers than anybody else's, and it was a mix of gossip and hard news, and it was a way in which people sort of found out what was going on behind closed doors, what the politicians didn't want to come out. Pearson's column could be pretty rough. When James Forrestal was Secretary of Defense, Pearson went after him so that it really contributed to Forrestal's mental collapse. And eventually Forrestal committed suicide, and a lot of people blamed Pearson. Even Pearson said lost some sleep at night, wondering whether he had contributed to this. But it certainly showed the power of the columnists in Washington. The most famous columnists for many years were Walter Lippmann and Joseph Alsop. Certainly plenty of others. Arthur Kroc had been a columnist for the New York Times for many years, but the Times wouldn't allow his column to be syndicated outside of their own newspaper. So it was Lippmann and Alsop whose columns got into the largest number of papers. And they began to polarize opinion about them, especially about the Cold War and about the Vietnam War. Walter Lippmann became the leading dove among the columnists. Joseph Alsop became the leading hawk. In my book, I talk about how Lyndon Johnson tried desperately to straddle these two, tried to convince both Lippmann and Alsop that he agreed with them, and he was on their side, that he was following their advice. Of course, eventually, both of them realized that he was lying to them, and this was, in many ways, the beginning of the credibility gap, that reporters began to doubt what Johnson was saying to them. Johnson perhaps put too much stock in what Lippmann and Alsop were writing and was, in a sense, obsessed with it. But he was convinced that they were getting the word across to, if not the general public, to certainly those who were really following what was going on in government and were in the position to influence policy that were being made. And his attempts to try to pacify those two columnists, and he's defeated in a sense on fronts, I thought was a fascinating account of the problems that politicians face and presidents face against this group of reporters who have a license to express their opinion. As Walter Lippmann called it, the business of being opinionated.
And there were only a few then. Now we see pundits and opinion makers on TV 24 hours a day, but there were really just a couple of big bears who were doing this.
That's right. Walter Lippmann was one of the first to make the jump to television. He had not been a very good radio commentator. He didn't have the kind of voice that carried well on radio. But radio, of course, is a hot medium, and it needs more emphasis behind it. Television was a cool medium, and Walter Lippmann, who was very erudite and who actually spoke in almost a whisper, the television picked that up in a way that made him very accessible, and he was very popular in a whole series of annual interviews that CBS did with him in the 1960s.
Did television change the Washington Press Corps more than anything else?
It did in many ways, and for the columnists at least, when they did make that transition to TV, they were by themselves. Today, there are lots of people who aren't columnists who are talking heads on television. You have competition from historians and from lawyers and from everybody else under the sun. But television came about in Washington in the 1940s. President Truman's State of the Union message was covered by television. Truman, who was running for re-election in a desperate election in 1948, allows TV into the White House. It's not a very auspicious beginning. The first television shot is actually of a reporter named Bryson Resch bending over the president's desk, and the camera is behind him as he's bending over trying to adjust President Truman's tie for that first shot. But politicians immediately began to try to get television on their side. Technology was working against television reporters for a long time, though. And at first, you had more cameramen than you had reporters. It's really not till the 1960s, late 50s, early 60s, when you have more ease of getting cameras out there, and when you have television news moving to a half an hour, and you don't need to just rely on an anchor sitting in a studio reading you the news, but now you want to have reporters who are out there giving reports. And CBS really creates this bench of reporters, a remarkable group of reporters in the 1960s. People like Dan Rather, Roger Mudd, Marvin Kalb, Fred Graham, they're just terrific. Daniel Shore. The other networks were envious of how much airtime those reporters got, and how much, when CBS News would come on, they would announce where all their reporters were stationed. In NBC, which had a very successful team of Huntley and Brinkley, they really put a lot more emphasis on Brinkley because of his personality. And so he wound up really reading most of the Washington news, and Washington reporters didn't get that much airtime. But the CBS crew really redefined the way television news was broadcast at that point.
And broadcast redefined the way newspaper and wire reporters did their jobs. You tell a story of Russell Baker talking about the Kennedy-Nixon debates.
Mm-hmm. Russell Baker was a columnist or a writer for the New York Times at the time, a very good Washington reporter. He'd covered the White House, he'd covered the Congress. He was in Chicago for the first Kennedy-Nixon debate in 1960, sitting in a studio with a monitor in front of him, but he was writing, and he had his head down writing. He barely looked up at the screen from time to time. And by the end of the debate, when he was finishing up his story, he was convinced that the debate was a tie. And he was shocked at how jubilant Kennedy's people were and how convinced they were that Kennedy had won that debate. And it slowly began to dawn on him that it was Kennedy had looked so much better, that was the edge that he had. And as he said, most of the audience was watching the debate, not trying to write during it. And then he wondered if anybody read his story the next day, because everybody had seen this debate for themselves. And for Baker, that was the turning point. I think for a lot of other scholars of the period, the Kennedy assassination, when television just suspended all of its broadcasting and focused just on that, was a moment in which television news clearly took the lead, because that's where people turned first. And I guess that's the way we define, who is the leading medium, is, when something happens, who do you turn to first? Television at that stage really took over. And of course, it was just at that moment that television evening news had gone to half an hour. They tried to go to an hour-long program. They never were able to, and I think they never were able to make that jump. And television network news is suffering dramatically now. It's got half the audience, really, in terms of the percentage of the audience that it had in 1980, because there's so much competition now from cable.
Well, that's right. That's another turning point in the way the Washington Press Corps works, which is now we have 24-hour news. And what was the punctuating moment for that?
Well, with cable news, at first when Ted Turner started CNN, the major networks just didn't take it seriously at all. I think CNN came into its own and probably brought the rest of cable news along with it during the Iraqi War, when Bernard Shaw, their chief anchor, a former CBS correspondent, was in Baghdad to interview Saddam Hussein when the war started. The first American missiles hit a television antenna that was where all the other networks were broadcasting from. CNN happened to have a different broadcasting operation, so they broadcast from CNN. Everybody, including President George H.W. Bush, was watching CNN to find out what was going on, because they were broadcasting live from the scene of the action. And that idea of 24-hour news and instantaneous news. Same thing happened with the shooting of President Reagan in 1981. CNN just happened to be covering what was going on at the time, and Bernard Shaw in the studio was able to give the first reports of what was going on. This really affected the way the network reporters did their business. Someone like Sam Donaldson, for instance, complained that before, when he had an exclusive, he could save it for the 6 or 7 o'clock news. Now, if he had an exclusive during the day, he had to get it on the air right away. Otherwise, it was going to be broadcast a dozen times on the various cable networks before he ever got on to do the evening news. And so this whole sense of having a deadline, or having a moment when, at 6 o'clock, that's when all stories had to be told by 6 o'clock, because that was the last moment before the network news could go on. Now you have a deadline every minute, essentially, the way the old wire services were.
In writing this book, what conclusions have you drawn about these animals in the Washington Press Corps? What are they like? What have you decided?
Well, they're fascinating people, and in my job as a Senate historian, I deal with reporters all the time. They call for information. I've been interested in how they seek information. I've been interested in the fact that they write under deadline. We historians, I had 10 years to write this book. Some reporters I talked to have 10 minutes to get the story out. And they have to know a lot about almost everything, because it's very hard to specialize as a reporter. You really have to be a generalist. You have to be alert to everything that's going on. You have to find out what all the other reporters are doing, what the pack is doing, but you also have to try to find something that's different to identify your own work from them. You're competing constantly with your colleagues. So there's a fascinating group of people, and I found that for the most part that the news that came out of Washington was reliable news. It was, for the most part, objective news. Politicians have never liked the news from Washington. They've always considered the news to be biased against them. But interestingly, liberal politicians have thought the news was biased against them, and conservative politicians have thought the news was biased against them. I think it's the tension between reporters and politicians is just because politicians are only satisfied with something they can write or broadcast themselves. And I always say that when the politicians don't complain about the press corps that we really have to worry. But certainly every president since George Washington has felt that the media was out to get him in some way or another, and has lamented this in this period. I enjoyed the hunt for a lot of these reporters. Many of them were very famous people who everybody has seen on television. Some of them were really obscure, and yet they were just fascinating people. One of the people who interested me a lot was a man named Lawrence Todd, who from 1927 to 1952 was the chief Washington correspondent for TASS, which was the Soviet news agency. And he was an American, a sort of a radical American, but he was reporting for the Soviet news agency. And he was very well liked inside the press corps. He could go into the Secretary of State's press conferences. When the Secretary of State went off the record, there was the TASS reporter taking notes. It was quite interesting phenomenon that was going on. One of the stipulations for being a TASS reporter is he couldn't join any political party. So I don't know what he would have done in the 1930s. But in the 1950s, when the congressional investigations were looking into communist subversion, they called Larry Todd to testify. And they said, have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? And he said, no. And these senators nearly fell over. They said, you've never been a communist? He said, no, I've never been to a communist meeting. I've never heard a Communist Party leader speak. I wasn't allowed to on my job. I was just a reporter. And in fact, the Soviet Union was very interested in getting essentially objective news from Larry Todd. They just wanted the facts. They'd put the spin on it when it got back to Moscow.
Do that themselves. What about the investigative reporters? Watergate certainly affected the way the Washington Press Corps worked. Has that gone through the system, or is it still a hangover from the Watergate investigative period?
Well, Washington reporters are not by training investigative reporters for the most part. As what somebody said, police reporters aren't the first ones who are going to report a police scandal, and the White House press corps is probably not the first group that's going to report a White House scandal. It's usually somebody from the outside who doubts the information they're getting who's going to break through. The muckrakers originally were not Washington reporters. They were New York reporters who came down occasionally to Washington. They didn't need to cultivate sources. They could afford to offend politicians. They could write what they saw, in a sense. There were a few investigative reporters, a man named Paul Anderson who helped to break the Teapot Dome scandal, and a few others along the way. But it's really not until Vietnam and Watergate come along that investigative reporting has a major impact in Washington. Seymour Hersh with the My Lai investigation, people not believing what the Pentagon is telling them, but doing, hunting for information for other places. And Woodward and Bernstein, the two Metro reporters, who go after a story that the Washington Post's own national desk and own White House reporters thought was ludicrous. They really couldn't believe that Richard Nixon, and they didn't like Richard Nixon, but they respected Richard Nixon. They couldn't believe he'd be so stupid as to bug his opponents at a time when he was clearly going to win re-election without too much trouble. So the White House press corps, for the most part, for about 6 months, really didn't follow the Watergate story. And it was the investigative reporters who were uncovering it. And then, of course, afterwards, everybody wanted to be an investigative reporter. And so there's a great burst of reporting afterwards. But investigative reporting is really very different than the typical reporting. For one, you really can't be an objective reporter if you're an investigative reporter. You can't believe that both sides are giving you equal information. You have to believe that one side is really wrong. Somebody is hiding something. You have to be willing to hunt beneath this, listen to the whistleblowers. I argue in the book that the leak is the flip side of the press release. And you always have to look at the motivation of the person who's doing the leaking. But Washington reporting depends to a large degree on reporters getting information that officials really don't want to get out.
Talk a little bit more about the leak. This is a Washington trick that reporters use. But what is a leak, and why do people put them out there?
Leaks are essentially things that officials don't want to live up to, in a sense. They want the information to get out there, but they don't want it attributed to them for one reason or another. Sometimes they're official leaks. The president leaks. Some of the president's advisors have argued that only the president should leak. It's his prerogative to leak. In other words, to float a trial balloon. Many people think that if Franklin Roosevelt had floated a trial balloon about the Supreme Court packing case in 1937, he would never have done it because he was so shrewd about floating trial balloons on so many other things. When it blew up, he had no place to hide, essentially. And certainly every other president has leaked over time. If you listen to the Nixon tapes, Nixon is boasting about how he leaked to the press at various times, especially during the Alger Hiss case. And many other people besides presidents and besides senators and representatives will leak to the press. Lower level bureaucrats will often blow the whistle on their agencies to get something out. Political opposition will leak to the reporters. But for one reason or another, they don't want their name attributed to what's going out. So reporters over time have developed all sorts of codes for what's on the record or off the record, or what's on background, not for attribution, deep background. This goes back to the 19th century. And in fact, reporters in the 19th century on 2 occasions were arrested and held prisoner in the Capitol building until they would divulge the source of their leak. Their newspapers doubled their salary for every day that they were in captivity, so that reduced their need to say, and in fact they never did say. Right now we have reporters who are being threatened with imprisonment because they won't divulge the source of a leak. If they ever did divulge the source of a leak, their usefulness as a reporter would pretty much be over, because who would provide them that kind of information in the future?
Do reporters need leaks more now because so much of Washington news is televised? The White House briefing, for example, used to be something that didn't happen on camera. Now it's always televised, or almost always on camera, certainly. And the White House press secretary who could float something privately before is now filmed doing so. Has the fact that everything is on camera now made the leak more necessary?
Everybody's looking for something to distinguish what they're doing. But in fact, you can go back to the days when Horace Greeley was a correspondent down here for his own newspaper in the 1840s and 50s. And he was saying that ever since Mother Eve, he says, people have wanted to know what they weren't supposed to know. And that's what sold newspapers in the 19th century. And of course, it sells whatever the medium is going on today. And most media is commercial activity, and it's competing with other commercial activity. So you're looking for something that's going to distinguish you. The internet right now has been breaking a lot of stories, much to the chagrin of regular reporters. And the question always is, do you go with a story that breaks on the internet if you don't have any other attribution? What's happened is a lot of people who are leaking information can shop the leak around. Maybe a newspaper reporter won't publish it because they can't get a second source on it, or a broadcaster won't go with it because they can't get it past their producers and others in the process. But then all of a sudden the story breaks on the Drudge Report, and then everybody feels, well, they can go with it now because they can cite that as their source. And so that has changed in the last 10 years very dramatically, the way things are going. But certainly everybody wants to know and wants to get beyond the press release and get beyond the press conference. And I think that's a universal desire in the press corps. There are just a lot more activities, a lot more reporters, a lot more types of broadcasting operations right now. And so that's increased the demand for that kind of news.
And what effect on the Washington press corps did the attacks of 9/11 happen? How is the press corps different now after that?
As my book ends on 9/11, and it begins with the bonus riots in 1932, with these reporters who were out in the middle of the street, extraordinary times, and it ends on a day in which no one knew what was happening, when the first pictures that came actually were taken before reporters ever got to the scene at the World Trade Towers, when reporters in Washington thought the story was in New York and didn't realize that a plane had crashed into the Pentagon, when reporters on one side of the Pentagon felt an explosion but didn't know what it was and had to be told by their anchors in New York what the pictures were coming in on this story. When a reporter would show up at his news office, first being told to go to New York and then being told, forget New York, go to the Pentagon. Getting caught up in the middle of the story, I think, really changed in many ways the way reporters looked at their business, but also the way the public looked at it. There was a decade in which the public, I think, was getting turned off from hard news, from Washington news, when it was just scandal news, when soft news features seemed to be taking over, when journalists argued that we were spending too much time covering the Pentagon and not enough time covering the supermarket. Well, after 9/11, covering the Pentagon could be justified again. And I think reporters, it helped considerably in terms of the general morale of the press corps. Certainly everybody felt very proud of what they did that day. And it was very interesting how, when something big happened, the public turned to the media right away. They wanted to find television reports on it. They went to the internet and they couldn't get on because there was such an overload on the internet. Although, fortunately for reporters, when their cell phones went out, they were often able to email stories back to their papers at the time. And so that helped the networking that was going on. The next day, newspapers printed extra editions and sold everything they had. And so the public came back and decided that Washington was important again. I had sort of tracked this rise and fall of Washington reporting in the 20th century, in which there was a time in which, everybody watched the evening news and everybody kept up with what was going on in Washington, to a point when you could sort of let that slip. Well, after 9/11, Washington news really came back into the center of things.
And you said it took you you did 10 years for this book?
Well, in many ways, it took me 20 years. I actually started doing my research back in 1980, but along the way, I wrote a book about the 19th century press corps called Press Gallery. And then I resisted writing this book for a long time because it just seemed to me that it was going to be too complicated. And in fact, it did take a very long time to put it together. I had to learn really very different histories of print broadcast and radio and television. And I think probably one of the advantages of this book is I had to start from scratch with this. I had to teach myself about how a network actually got started. I don't try to take anything for granted as a result in this book. And then how it actually got into Washington. And who were the first radio reporters in Washington? Who were the first television reporters? What obstacles did they face? And I think that helped me definitely in dealing with the internet. The internet actually didn't even exist at the time I started doing the research on this book. And really the last chapter of the book, called Anyone with a Modem, wrote itself as day by day as I was doing the research. I didn't know how it was going to end until I got to the end. And in fact, I thought that the book would end in 2000. And I originally was going to end it with the election of 2000 as the end of the 20th century. And then I was in the Capitol on September 11th, and I was part of the group that was evacuated along with all those reporters and others, and I realized this really was the end of the story.
You've hinted at it, but tell us about your day job, what you're doing when you're not writing these books.
I've had a very great opportunity since 1976. Just after I got my PhD in history, I was hired to be the Associate Historian of the Senate Historical Office, and I still hold that job today. I do an oral history program for the Senate. I interview retired staff members, occasionally retired senators, although most of them are being interviewed by the institutions that are getting their papers. I edit historical documents for publication from the Foreign Relations Committee, also the Joe McCarthy hearings for publication. And I spend a good part of almost every working day on the phone talking to reporters who are in the midst of a story. If the Senate's in business that day, in session, and something's happened, everybody wants to know, has it happened before? How often has it happened? Would it be accurate to say this? And there are a lot of reporters who call regularly, others who call only for one particular story. But I got to know a lot of reporters. I got curious about them, and that's what led me into doing this research and doing the writing.
And how do you do the writing? Is it something you do every day? Is it something you do in the morning? Give us a little bit about the art of this.
Unfortunately, the one thing a public historian doesn't have is an academic calendar, and so I don't have long summer vacations. But I do have the Library of Congress that's right nearby and the National Archives, and so I was able to get some of my research time while I was here in Washington. When I traveled to give a talk at a university, I would always check with the university archives to see. I was at Mississippi State, and they had the Turner Catledge papers, who was a Washington correspondent, later managing editor at the New York Times. It was full of good stuff. And so I spent time there. I would not probably have gotten to Starkville, Mississippi otherwise. But I tried to take advantage of those opportunities. And then I spent pretty much every evening and every weekend doing some research or some writing over a very long period of time. And what kept me going was I was really interested in these people. It was a wonderful periods of discovery. I mentioned Lawrence Todd, the task reporter. I've been studying him for, I can't tell you how long, and then one day up popped on the Library of Congress card catalog an unpublished memoir of Lawrence Todd in 1996. Fortunately, it listed the fact that his grandson had published it. I called his grandson living in Alaska. He told me that his father was still living, Todd's son. Todd's son then sent me a correspondence that he had from his father. I learned all this about a person who seemed so obscure. And part of the fun of doing this project was really finding more about them and discovering them. Many of them were very famous people. Nancy Dickerson was one of the people I studied. People that I'd watched on television when I was a kid, and just was curious, who were these people? What were they doing? What were their lives like? Roger Mudd, in many ways, I think, was the best correspondent that television ever put on Capitol Hill. And his reporting from the Senate steps during the 1964 Civil Rights Act probably had an impact on the passage of the Civil Rights Bill, because for 80 or 55 days, I guess it was, that the filibuster was going on, 87 days the whole debate was going on, Mudd was there every single day, reporting several times a day. And he was talking to both sides, but those who were filibustering realized that he was drawing attention to the fact that they were obstructing this civil rights legislation. And they then had the Capitol Police move him off the steps over across the street onto the grass. But his story really had an impact at the time. And it's unfortunate that television, for the most part, was not able to devote as much sustained attention to any one story that they did to that Civil Rights Bill. But there were moments. The Army-McCarthy hearings certainly was a moment which television played a role in all of that. So as an historian, as someone who lived through this time period, I just wanted to know who were these people who were writing the story. And also as an historian who cites journalists in my footnotes, I want to know how accurate is the news that they're reporting. And I came away much more confident with in newspaper reporters and magazine reporters and television reporters who were essentially professionals trying to do their job. And I think the presidents and the politicians who have been most successful are the ones who realized that reporters were trying to do a job. John Kennedy had been a reporter. He actually was a newspaper reporter. He knew what reporters were after, and he helped provide it for them. He got the best press. It wasn't just because he was a nice guy. He understood how the press operated. Richard Nixon was just the opposite. He really disliked the press, and the press felt that very strongly along the way, and that affected the way his news reporting was. I don't think it was necessarily just that it was an ideological thing. Lyndon Johnson, in many ways, was complaining about the exact same things that Richard Nixon did, about television networks having a monopoly over the news and things like that. Nixon saw it as ideological, but I think it was partly the natural relationship between the media and the politicians, and also the fact that Richard Nixon hated the press and they knew it.
It's a wonderful and very interesting read. Thank you so much for taking the time out. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks.
Next Sunday on Afterwards, former CBS foreign correspondent Tom Fenton on his latest Bad News, the decline of reporting, the business of news, and the danger to us all. In the book, Mr. Fenton argues that the news media must disengage from the entertainment industry to regain the trust of the public. He'll be interviewed by the former co-host of CBS Nightly News and moderator of NBC Meet the Press, Roger Mudd. Afterwards, every Sunday at 6 and 9 p.m. Eastern, on Book TV, on C-SPAN 2.
Book TV is brought to you as a public